Let's start first with iron. And the thing about iron is that I think most of us only consider it when we're thinking about iron in the bloodstream, so hemoglobin and oxygen transport. And maybe we think about it in terms of a few other things. But surprisingly enough, iron's involved in just a host of things. And in two ways, there's something called an iron sulfur complex. That is a rabbit hole I have not completely gotten down yet, but we need those for a lot of the enzymatic processes in the body. So I want us to have like a placeholder for that because that is something I'm going to dig into. And then, of course, we use iron in active ways via other kinds of enzymes, not an iron sulfur complex, but iron is involved in other kinds of enzymes, and it's involved in a number of different kinds of processes. And unfortunately, we're also talking about a whole body systemic kind of impact. So if iron's low, this can affect your kidneys because your kidneys are involved in red blood cell production. So if iron's too low, kidneys will not be able to produce APO, which is something that talks to the bone marrow to help us produce enough red blood cells. So there's this little piece there. And because it's affecting the kidneys as well, because kidneys can be affected by oxalate, if the kidneys are already struggling to try and produce some of the things they're supposed to produce, and then on top of that, your iron is too low, we can have something there that would be significant in terms of having enough red blood cell production. And really, the issue with iron is that iron can be depleted by oxalate. And so we might not have enough iron, and that can be systemic. So oxalate can be depleting iron right from inside the gut. So if we've eaten an iron-rich meal and we've eaten that in combination with something where there's a reasonable amount of oxalate, then as that iron-rich food and your oxalate-rich food moves through the gut, you can actually have iron and oxalate binding inside the gut so that you never get a chance to absorb it. And that iron's just going to leave with the stool. Now, we deliberately do that to some degree with calcium. We actually try to bind some of the higher oxalate that we might have in our intake with calcium to try and avoid absorbing that oxalate. But the problem with iron is that we absorb very little of iron to start out with. It's managed in a very tight range. So even if you're eating a high iron source, let's say something like steak, a 12-ounce steak, so that's a good size steak, right? That might give you 7 to 7.5 milligrams of iron. That's all you're going to get from a 12-ounce steak. So we're not getting a lot of iron even from these foods that we think of as very high iron sources. That's not even thinking about things like plant foods. Plant foods can provide you with non-heme iron. So you have two forms of iron. You have what we call heme iron, which is what you get with an animal food. You have non-heme iron, which is what you get with a plant food. Of an animal food, we might absorb on a good day up to 30% of that heme iron. When you're talking about plant foods that have iron, your absorption could be as little as 5% of what that non-heme iron is. And so we're not getting a lot of iron necessarily in our diets, and our recommended daily intake, if you're a woman who's still menstruating, is I believe about 20 milligrams. And if you think about the fact that steak's one of our high iron foods and that you're going to get like 7 milligrams in 12 ounces of steak, we're talking a lot of care and concern has to go into how much iron you're getting so that you're actually absorbing a lot. It takes a long time for iron to deplete. So that's the good news. Like if you haven't been paying attention, you don't necessarily deplete iron in an instant. But correspondingly, it takes a long time for iron to increase. So if we've dropped low, we could have months of working at it to get it up to where we want it to be. And because oxalate's disrupting the absorption, we're already right out of the gate maybe not getting all the iron that's in our food. Then it turns out once we do absorb absorb it, there's a fair amount of control on the iron that we absorb. Some of it will be moved into cells in the gut lining and will be moved into ferritin to be stored there. If it's never pulled out of storage, when we slough off some of those cells as our digestive tract sort of renews and rebuilds, we'll just lose that iron. So we can actually have done the work to absorb iron that we are kind of holding on to in storage in case we need it, and we end up just sloughing it off essentially as we lose some of that lining. So of the iron that we absorb, then we're looking at a smaller proportion again, which is not stored in ferritin, but which is moved right away by a variety of transfer mechanisms into the hemoglobin and into active use. So there's a bunch of delimiters, if you will, at every step. And for that matter, even the iron that's coming into your gut that you do have a chance to absorb. If you're eating a meal where that meal includes both iron and calcium, iron and calcium will compete with each other for uptake into the body. So you actually want to kind of isolate iron where you really want to absorb it. You want to have a meal that might be focused on iron absorption, because if you're consuming your iron with calcium or calcium foods like dairy, you're going to reduce the amount of iron that you actually absorb. So there's so many bits and pieces here that affect iron absorption. If you're low, those are things we'd have to keep in mind. Things like phytates from grains and legumes, those will also impact your ability to absorb iron. So there's lots of things that reduce how much iron we are able to take up. So we are not, I'm going to say in general, we don't really pay attention to iron in our diet unless we've had iron anemia at one point or another. And even I, who have been anemic, have not paid as much attention to iron as I think I should have, because there is a real challenge to getting it into the system. So you've got it into the system. Let's say we've managed to get over all the hurdles. We had a beautiful steak. We ate it with red peppers and we ate it with mango because we're getting some vitamin C to help us uptake all that lovely iron in the steak, and we've got it into our system. Once we've got it there, as the iron is being digested, it's converted actually from iron that's got a triple positive to iron with a double positive. So there's like an electrical charge on ions. Minerals are actually cations or cations because they are positively charged. Things like oxalate are anions because they are negatively charged. So we have to convert the iron as it comes into this double positive. That double positive is what's getting carried into our bloodstream. Our bodies will go through more than one conversion of the form of iron, but once it's available in the bloodstream, our body's going to do everything it can to get it either safely into a red blood cell where it's going to be part of hemoglobin, or going to try to get it safely into a storage form. So that's where transferrin comes in. So if you think of iron in hemoglobin as iron at work, and it could, iron in other active forms could also be iron at work, but let's just use hemoglobin as the example. And then iron at home is ferritin. Iron that's in storage is waiting to be called up is in ferritin. And what moves between those is transferrin. It's a transport molecule. Turns out that transferrin binds iron to it. So if you think of it as like a bus, iron takes up a seat. Something called carbonate takes up a seat, not bicarbonate, just carbonate takes up a seat. And that helps to bind the iron to the transferrin. But the bond between the iron and the carbonate is kind of loose. So that means transferrin can take that iron to a location while keeping it on the bus, so to speak. And the carbonate is not so bonded to it that that iron can't be released and dropped off to ferritin or storage form or whatever. Well, if oxalate gets on the bus, oxalate binds to the iron and oxalate doesn't let it go. So what you end up with is a transferrin bus that's supposed to be moving iron from location to location safely safely because iron by itself in the bloodstream is actually oxidative. So the body doesn't want too much iron. That's part of the reason we have so many hurdles to go through to get it in. And as critical as it is to our metabolism, we want to regulate it very tightly. So we've got this iron, we've got it in, we got it on the bus, and now we can't get it off the bus. That's a problem. That's essentially depleting us of iron that we would otherwise be able to use, even though it's present in the system. We don't have access to it. And in fact, that could have something to do with why iron might accumulate in the ferritin status. Because if you've got it as ferritin and you can't get it out of ferritin and transferrin can't take it into an active location where it's needed, then you can have some ferritin accumulating. And when that happens, low ferritin's bad, low iron is bad, high ferritin is bad too. So the challenge here is this management and this very tight tolerance. And secondarily, while oxalate kind of functionally depletes iron because you can't get access to it, as iron drops, histamine goes up. And it looks like this is somewhat accidental, but part of what we need in order to get iron out of our diets is high enough histamine in the stomach to drive stomach acid. So it doesn't look like it's completely deliberate, but higher stomach acid is helpful so that we can convert iron as it comes in this triple positive form to a double positive form. That's the form in which we can use it. But of course, if iron's too low and histamine's going up, those of us who have problems with oxalate, we may already be having histamine symptoms. We may already be having pain and inflammation, and all of that's being driven higher. The more inflamed the body is, the more likely the body accumulates ferritin. I have not been able to figure out if that is actually oxalate driven potentially. Like that would be my working hypothesis, that oxalate's one of the drivers because it can turn on inflammation in the body and it can turn on inflammation at the cellular level. And ferritin is going to be accumulating inside cells because that's where the storage is. So we've got this sort of really gnarly kind of tangled mess where if your iron is too low, you're turning up histamine. If your oxalate's too high, you're turning up histamine. If oxalate is high in the body, you're probably depleting iron in a variety of ways, both on the way in and in terms of not being able to retrieve it from the transferrin molecule. And high histamine is going to drive a lot of symptoms, both neurological as well as physiological. Then it turns out that low iron also affects your ability to produce dopamine and affects your ability to produce serotonin. So you could have oxalate inflammation affecting the nervous system and dysregulating it. Low iron is going to affect the nervous system and dysregulate it. And there's clear relationship between low iron and ADHD. It's such a good, close, and well understood relationship that young kids who have ADHD, if they put them on iron, they can reduce their symptoms over the next 12 weeks. The last research that I looked at 12 weeks. In 12 weeks, they were able to take kids who had very high levels of ADHD and bring them like quite a long way along in terms of healing and being better regulated. So, the challenge here is that when iron is low, we're going to impact the brain, we're going to impact inflammation, we're going to impact a lot of organs, we're going to impact enzymatic functions across the body. When oxalate is high, we're going to drive down iron with all the aforementioned issues. We're going to drive up inflammation, which could put us in a bit of a bind in terms of potentially accumulating ferritin, even if we might be low in iron in active available form. And high ferritin also causes neurological symptoms. So things like brain fog and memory lapses can be related to high ferritin. So low ferritin is going to affect the brain, high ferritin is going to affect the brain. Oxalate's in the middle of this mess. And what I realized is that the further I dug into this, the more we needed needed to know where we are in our iron status if we're going to actually manage to heal, both from what oxalate's doing, but also if we've got histamine and mast cell issues as they say, a comorbidity of what's going on with oxalate. So I know it's kind of rambly, but the problem here is that we're potentially over accumulating in storage or under accumulating, because if the transferrin bus can't move, maybe you're not getting it into ferritin. If the transferrin bus can't move, maybe you're not getting it out. And there's this spot that oxalate's taking up in the middle there, both in terms of your absorption and your use of iron, where it can be messing things up. Now, so what kinds of tests do we need to do to kind of figure out where we are in this thing, given that both high and low ferritin in particular can be a real outcome of what oxalate's doing in the system? So what you need are tests for like hemoglobin, serum iron. They would call it those, or I mean, an RBC iron, which is your red blood cell iron. Those kinds of things are where we're finding out about active available iron. Then you need to also look at iron binding. Iron binding is that transferrin molecule. Do we have enough of it? Because that's another thing. If we're having a hard time even building that because of the disruption from oxalate, we might need to support transferrin itself. That's one way that some people have been able to fix some issues with iron, especially if we're trying to get it out of the ferritin form. If we can get more transferrin buses, that can be helpful. And then you check your ferritin as well. Those three are what I'm seeing as key indicators of if oxalate's messing with iron metabolism, that can help us identify exactly where. Supplements. This is where I think we have an ability to respond to what's going on here. So if your iron is low, taking an iron supplement, low dose, it's going to take a while before you feel better, because especially if your iron's very low, and it takes a while for us to absorb it. But constructing what I would call an iron focused, a high iron absorption meal is a really smart thing to do once a day. Take your supplement with that, make sure it's low oxalate, higher in vitamin C, no grains, no legumes, because those are going to interfere with your absorption. So if you're trying to maximize as much absorption as possible, it's going to be a fairly simple meal. It's probably going to be a fair bit of meat and then high vitamin C, low oxalate sources that are not grains or legumes. I've got a list of those. So maybe I'll get that as part of this up on the group so that we can have that as a resource. And then focus on your other minerals away from your iron absorption. So magnesium would be okay. There's no competition there. But things like calcium and zinc will compete with iron for uptake. So at one point in time, after the birth of my second child, when I knew I was really low in iron, I had an iron-rich meal, and then I had a calcium-rich meal, and then I had a free-for-all. I did that every day. Breakfast was iron-rich, lunch was calcium-rich, supper, whatever. And that approach helped me start to make sure that my mineral status was okay, because we don't want iron to so overshadow calcium that we don't have enough calcium, or we don't have enough magnesium, or we don't have enough something else. So sometimes it'll mean separating things a little bit. If your ferritin is high and you need to actually get that down, that one has a little more complexity to it. There are some great supplements that help, which is really interesting. Resveratrol, which has great research on healthy aging, actually helps you to reduce ferritin in the body. That's an interesting support. There's a couple of other really good supplements here. There's some research that I'm still doing on some of those, but resveratrol is so uncomplicated that that's a great one to just can keep in mind. But the other thing you can do, if your ferritin's too high, but you want the nutrients that you can get from things like red meat or other high iron sources, then you deliberately eat it with a grain, with a legume, with calcium, because then you're going to reduce the amount of iron that you're absorbing. But in this case, you're doing it deliberately because your ferritin's too high. So it's turning the approach for low iron on its head if you've got higher iron. And then if you have really high ferritin, I have a client right now where, ideal ferritin for a woman should probably be up to about 80 micrograms per liter in your body, and she's at 540. It's kind of high. And she hasn't been feeling good, so it makes sense. Blood donation is one of the best things you can do. So somebody else can benefit and you get rid of some of your ferritin overload, because with that loss of blood, your body then has more push to pull that ferritin out of storage, and that can be very helpful. But supplements that take down inflammation are going to be really important if you're accumulating ferritin, because that's usually the driver for ferritin accumulation. So again, oxalate, because it's an inflammatory driver, it would be important to figure out what things help to bring down your inflammation and what works for you in terms of oxalate. Anti-inflammatory supplements that I love personally would include methionine, which is an amino acid. I consider that kind of the little brother of MSM. Those are both sulfur related supplements, so they probably help with this iron sulfur complex, which I'll get more into when we do another session. But both of them help to reduce inflammation in the body. If you have problems with sulfur based supplements, obviously these are not going to be the right ones for you. And then I would look at things like CoQ10, vitamin E, things where we're going to support anti-inflammatory benefits to the body. Omega-3s are another good one, but we're not going to be touching sulfur chemistry if your system's not ready for it. So some of this requires a bit of nuance. But the more fragile you are, the more difficult supplements are to get started on, the more likely I'd want you to go to the little brothers of, any big gun. So the more likely I'd say methionine over MSM, and the more likely I would say something like vitamin E over CoQ10. You might want to start and work your way up to bigger, more powerful supplements to deal with